Welcome to the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. This is a podcast that explores a public health approach to improving the mental health of Black boys while challenging the negative stereotypes often associated with this demographic in the society. This is a happiness research-informed podcast themed on the 8 pillars of happiness explored on my research trip to the top 5 happiest countries in the world. Now, isn't that cool? Welcome to another episode of the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. Today's episode, we're going to be exploring the pillar of happiness, which is the togetherness and belonging pillar. And on this pillar, we're going to specifically kind of narrow into the theme of role models. What does that mean in the context of Black boys, in the context of raising boys particularly? What are the impacts of role models as a theme, as an idea, philosophically, but also practically? And also, what are some of the challenges that come from this conceptual idea of role modeling? How does this impact elements such as serious youth violence, elements such as self-esteem of Black boys? How does this impact the coercion and exploitation of Black boys into the drug industry, county lines, and things of that nature? So we're going to explore that. This is going to be a 2-part episode, in that one episode is going to be specifically focusing around the idea of role models, and then the second episode will then be following specifically around the role of Black fathers as an idea and what is often leveled at that particular idea of Black fatherhood and the kinds of statistics and evidence and tropes that kind of follow through that idea. So it's going to be 2-parter. I'm really excited to kind of delve into this particular theme. And yeah, as always, we're going to kind of start with the research and kind of contextual piece. And I'm going to play you an audio from some of the young people. So the idea of role models have become confused and conflated with heroes and mentors, both of which offer some tangible meaning for young Black people. But the distance and otherness of the concept of the heroic figure, for one thing, allows for fantasizing and stimulates in the imagination of young kids, which on the one hand is a really great thing. But when we think about tangibility and looking at people in direct proximity to them, what role does this play and how that impacts the ways in which that might raise aspiration, or in which case actually make them disassociate from that particular idea as something that's unachievable for them? Mentors, on the other hand, which is where I'm going to try and steer this conversation to, from the concept of role modeling to actually the tangible concept of mentoring. And mentors, on the other hand, are very much about what's currently happening in the present, showing up in everyday life, modeling something that might be very counter heteronormative or counter Black masculine to another young Black child, and seeing these things transpire in their everyday lives, be it their mother, their uncle, their auntie, or somebody down the road, or their father, or whoever it might be. The idea of somebody taking up physical space in a way that restructures the ideologies or the tropes that young Black boys perhaps might have been accustomed to either in their everyday lives or through the popular media that they consume. So that is where I think I'm going to try and navigate this conversation to, as a counter ideology to the idea of role modeling, which, I think those two things are really interesting but could be easily conflated. So what's really interesting is, a lot of people talk about the idea of role models and people who are incredibly successful and quite exceptional in many cases in terms of their achievements, who happen to be Black, and use those as a beacon of hope, use those as they did it so you can do it too. And this idea of Black exceptionalism is one that I think really is a very interesting exploration when we start to think about the power that this idea of role modeling can be in the negative way, as well as potentially in a positive way, in impacting the aspirational levels and the achievement levels of young Black kids in the society that we are living in. But understanding that this society that we're living in is not outside of the structures and the institutional discriminations that we are still fighting for. Case in point, the Black Lives Iteration movement right now. Understanding that outside of all of this structural, societal, institutional, racial discrimination and systems that are put in place to directly inhibit the trajectory of young Black kids into the society to be able to have equal footing in the job market, in the house market, in the education market, in the staying alive market. Outside of these things, the concept of role modeling is futile, because no matter how much I grow up looking at Obama and thinking that is somebody that represents Black ideal of masculinity from rags to riches, or looking at somebody like, say, Raheem Sterling, even much more local in that context, So someone like him, I think, looking at his trajectory and thinking, yeah, I mean, he's an incredible footballer who's come from a very traumatic past in terms of witnessing his father being murdered as a young child and his parents having to flee Jamaica and then, raise him over here. And he succeeded to be one of the greatest football players in our current time. Seeing that as a model of he's done it, you can do it, is a very, very dangerous model to present to a young child, because that's not the root. If we understand Raheem Sterling's story, we'll understand there were very interesting intersectional moments that allowed for his success to happen. And without considering those individual interruptions, be it, his coach or his whoever it is that intervened in a moment where certain things were inevitably going to fall in line for him based on the environment that he grew up in, based on the structures that were available in the schools that he went to. All those factors are equally as important as presenting this child as this person to aspire to, without understanding the socioeconomic factors, without understanding the institutional factors that might have prohibited that child. And against all those odds, he became Raheem Sterling, who we know today. Without actually framing the concept of role modeling in that context, we are really looking at something that could be quite dangerous as a model to present to young people. And that's one thing I think we're going to explore today in terms of understanding how this could be weaponized as a trope that becomes very dangerous for young people to model and to look at those people as things that they should aspire for, without, as a society, collectively thinking about how we can actually challenge and change the structures that exist still in the communities that these boys grow up in the schools that these boys have to go to, in the healthcare system, in the criminal justice system, without actually exploring all of these things. The idea of role modeling is such a futile one and could be negatively weaponized for sure. So that's something I think is really important to really think about when we are trying to place the concept of role modeling as a aspirational tool to young people to aspire to. At this point, I'm going to play you guys an audio clip of some young people talking about some people who they have identified as role models in their everyday lives and the reasons behind that and some of the challenges that come with some of those revelations from those young people.
It's powerful what you're trying to what you're trying to say is good, cause obviously us young black boys, we always listen to drill and them type of stuff. We always think, oh yeah, get the girl money, that, all that, but then they don't the beat was hard and then the way, it wasn't rhyming, but the bars he was saying were cold, so, and obviously could we listen to this type of music, we're gonna reflect on what you're trying to say.
That's powerful.
It's kind of touching, isn't it?
Yeah, how so?
Because you start as a good Christian boy, go to church with your mum on Sundays. Now you met someone older than you. You want to be like them, innit? You get into that kind of life. When you get into that kind of life, there's no coming out unless you're a dead man.
Hear everything, but you're helping kids like us running around London. At the same time, getting blended up, so you look stylish and that, so that's why
I feel honored to hear that, because I think it's really great that you can see those things that inspire you and makes you think that it's probably possible for you to do exactly the same thing you're doing. So I think that's really great to hear that you see inspiration in things that I'm doing.
It's the first person who was the end.
Yeah.
It made me feel God. Definitely, you know what I mean? It's hard to explain it. You know what I mean? Really positivity and stuff like that. Also, our person, Raheem Sterling.
My father, he makes a lot of sacrifices. My mum, she never gave up on me.
You, of course, the words you say are touching. It changed the way I see it.
The one and only person coming back as really inspired the whole of this classroom to provide their family with a better lifestyle instead of going down the way of the normal black boy, the way the stereotypical. Exactly, it's the stereotypical type of black boy that trying to get the money through the illegal ways. He taught us the way of basically how positivity is white life.
So as always, after hearing these clips back, it always brings a smile to my mind, because it kind of teleports me back to a time when I was in a classroom engaging in these intricate conversations and interesting conversations with these incredibly bright young boys. But some of the takeaways from this particular duo of clips, I think the first one was this young person was talking about a poetic piece that I wrote as a response to some of the things that we were talking about, and I played that back to them in the classroom. And he was talking about how that really connected to him in a way that, because they listened to this type of music, be it music that was drill in terms of the sonic sound of it, but actually the content that I was exploring in that allowed them, which was a story that I painted about, it was called Rose from the Concrete, and how that story really allowed him to see particular things about the dangers of not exploring the kinds of figures that they spend a lot of time with and the kinds of influences that those people might have on them in their everyday lives. And another young person spoke about the journey of trying to be a child who abstains from all of these things that are knocking on their doors. And you try to be a good child, you go to church and all these other things, and all of a sudden, if there's a deficit of positive mentorship in the household or in the vicinity of the household or in the closer community, then that child reverts to the void that is being filled by another figure, which in most cases are other male figures that then might identify the need this child has to be shown love or to be taken under their wing or to be guided in some way. And often in some cases, this child gets exploited into particular industries like the gang industry or the drug trade and things like that. And how, that is the inevitable journey of a child. And ultimately, by the time they realize the dangers, they might be too late, because the only option is either they decide to get killed from disloyalty or treachery in that case. So that was, again, something that was really harrowing and very interesting to explore from a young person's perspective in terms of the direct experiences that they might have had in that case around the allures of male mentorship or role models in the environment and some of the dangers that are readily available or associated with that. So that's something to really, again, think about. Obviously, I work with these young people, some of them 8 weeks minimum. In some cases, the alumni group I work with for about 8 months on the pilot program. And since then, I've developed like a alumni group with those group of young people. And therefore, the showing up element of me coming into that space and being consistent in that space and actually being privileged enough to model something that is completely different to these young people when they think about Black masculinity or they think about ideas of what success might look like in something that is atypical to them in certain ways, without looking at the context of who people tend to put in front of young people to model. I love these people. I'm just using this in context. People like Stormzy or people like, Raheem Sterling or people like Obama, who are incredible men that have done amazing things. And, in some cases, people talk about Serena, people talk about Oprah, all these incredible people as well. But what is missing in those conversations is context, right? Because for a young child that lives in a council estate in Stockwell or in Brixton or in Hackney or in Peckham, talking to them about Obama, talking to them about Oprah, talking to them about Oswald Boateng, talking to them about Raheem Sterling, all these kinds of people. On the one hand, the young person's like, yeah, that's cool. That's somebody that looks like me. One, there's a beauty and there's a power in representation first. But it doesn't stop there, right? Because they say, okay, it looks like me, cool. But what does he know about where I've come from? Or does he know about what's happening to me on a regular basis, right? Because the thing is, against the odds, these people broke through. And we can have another conversation about the entertainment industry and why that is a readily available platform where Black people exercise their resistance and their radicality to the idea of the societal glass ceiling that has been placed. So against odds, those industries tend to be places where the autonomy and the agency and the individuality and the monetization of Black culture is being able to thrive, right? So therefore, there becomes an oversaturation of those industries with people like us, that look like us, that have come from similar backgrounds to us and have thrived in those environments, right? So then those people get leveled to us as models that we should aspire for. Whereas without exploring the context that against all odds, against all the societal, institutional, discriminatory factors and systems that are in place, these people have been able to thrive, right? And again, we don't look at the multiplicity of industries where this occurs, right? Which is where then I think about and talk about the idea of mentorship. People who are in similar industries that young people might not even visualize that there are people that look like them in those industries, like doctors or creatives or tech people, and the kind of visibility of those industries. Most people would not assume that there's a lot of Black women in tech, right? Because those ideas and the visibility and the aesthetics are not ones that are being pushed out. And those are really important, diverse aesthetics of role modeling that could be really important. The idea that, there's a lot of other industries that are not valued as much when we think about how to actually spark the aspiration levels of young people. Instead we think about the tropes like the music, the rap, the drill, the fashion, and all these other industries, which are incredible industries. And by no means am I knocking that, but there has to be a plethora of exploration of industries where people not just them and their achievement levels, but the characteristics and the qualities are the things that are modeled, which is where then the concept of mentoring differs from that, because the idea of having somebody who's relatable, who's tangible, somebody who they see and they speak to and hear from, in which case the project provides the opportunity for me to be that in some cases to a lot of young boys, to model something that they can touch and see and hear and be like, wow, I didn't know that you came from these bits, yeah, calm. And then what? How did you end up being someone who makes money from photography and film and all that? Like, and letting them know I didn't go to no film school. I picked up a camera because a friend of mine gave me one because I didn't have that in my own kind of armory in the first place, and how I, exercised the curiosity and the creative curiosity to be open to failing, and how that led me down another road because of curiosity, and how I was absolutely determined to improve my skill sets, and how I took courses, how I, hounded people to mentor me to do this and to do that. Those are important things to accompany the concept of role modeling. Without those things, we are setting young people up to fail. We're setting them down a very dangerous trajectory without contextualizing the concept of role modeling as something that is almost heroic in its context. The fact that a young person has to, or black person has to defy all these odds to be in a position where they are spoken of as a role model. If we can look at, contexts like Stormzy and the environment that he grew up in his particular case without a father in a part of South London that everything and everywhere around him, was involved in, street violence and drug trade and all of these things. But actually his elements of discipline, his elements of resiliency, his elements of all these interventions in his life, right? Which you cannot separate from the outcome that we're looking at until we start to connect those elements and deliver that as a full package and context to young people, we would essentially be setting them up to fail. So that's another thing that's really important. And then this touches on the concept of respectability politics. The idea that because I'm an upstanding, good person, I've made it through here, so you should be able to do that by modeling how I live my life. And I think there's a danger to that. And I hear that a lot, I'm sure often in goodwill, but there is a danger associated with that because some people think and purport this idea that for you to be a role model, you have to be squeaky clean and perfect. And therefore, if I'm stopped by the police, how can I be stopped? I'm a good black person, right? I do all these good things for the community. Why should I be accosted by the police? Why should I be met with these stereotypes when I am a good black, right? And again, that's a dangerous trope because ultimately those are things that shouldn't be afforded. Well, they're not afforded to black people in comparison to other races, especially white men or white folks. They don't have to plead their collective or their individual. They don't have to plead their individual innocence in comparison to their collective narrative that's associated with them. So actually we've fallen and feeding into that trope by saying, well, I'm a good upstanding black man, so why should this happen to me? The question is, why should that happen to any black person, period, right? And ultimately the concept of role modeling, this exceptional black folks and heralding them as what we should aspire for, I think also holds its own dangerous card with it, because what it doesn't do is doesn't provide nuance. It doesn't critique the systems that make their journey much more challenging. Another thing that's really important to explore in this context as well is the role that, popular media, the arts, music, films, plays, all these popular media, what role they play in also feeding into these tropes and these ideas, right? Because just like the young boy said, as black boys, we listen to this type of music a lot. So we cannot dissociate what young people consume from how this impacts on the psychological construction of their own images. And therefore, understanding that in the absence of physical mentors and people they can aspire to in their everyday lives and their communities who are upstanding, who are modeling behaviors and qualities and characteristics that are incredibly aspirational. Outside of that, what young people then resort to, or even in conjunction with that, is the imagery and ideas that are presented to them in the audio that they listen to, the music, in the visual, the films and all these things, the ways in which they're represented, the ways in which tropes are being played out for monetary reasons. Understanding those ideas and how this feeds the self-fulfilling prophecy that also inevitably follows, it's also really important to critique that. And how as creators, as artists who fight to get into the door, the question for us is, are we also doing equal amounts of damage by actually monetizing dramatizing our trope of blackness in these spaces because we know that these things are easily monetizable, because we know that these things feed into the capitalist agenda. We know that these things bring us money and essentially help us get the bag at the expense of what? And this is what this whole conversation is about, understanding that this is at the expense of the thriving of black kids, black boys specifically, in terms of, modeling ideas of themselves, especially if they grew up in a household that's devoid of other positive versions of masculinity or black men that help them balance out this ideology. So that's something that I think is really important for us to take on responsibility and be much more cognitively aware when we create, when we consume, and when we also project these ideas and these images and these art forms to young people without critiquing, without allowing them to consume and then to critically explore what it is they just listen to and what are the ideas that come from those pieces of medium. So that's something that's really important to explore in this case. Another thing that I think is really important to explore is the idea of representation. I touched on that earlier. And representation is a very powerful tool. We all know this, because the less of yourself you see, the less belief there is in you that you can aspire to be any of these other things, right? Kids growing up and not seeing themselves in books, kids growing up and not seeing anything but particular roles of themselves or caricatures of themselves on TV or in movies, kids not seeing people like them in the tech industry, in hospitals, in TV roles behind the camera, in theaters as classical singers, all these other things that are not readily available for young kids of color or black kids, particularly seeing themselves outside of industries such as sports, music, and maybe films in particular tropes. Understanding that there's a danger to that. So this is why representation really matters, right? Because for me, growing up, where I was able to assign people that modeled positivity and modeled versions that I wanted to aspire for were mainly in music and media. And there's a reason why I gravitated to particular people, because they connected to my soul in ways that were very true to who I was, and based on shared experiences, knowing that majority of the people that I connected to, whether consciously or subconsciously, there were similarities in that, and therefore the ways in which that played out in those people's art forms was something that resonated with me. And that's why Tupac, was obviously a big one for me. So was Common, but then there were a lot of other female role models as well, like Lauryn Hill, who connected to me in those ways because of authenticity. So therefore, understanding that for me, those people spoke to me because I had a poetic penchant. So those people connected to me in ways that spoke directly to my soul, as well as, lots of other things and other people who fed the immediacy of some of the energies that I had. And maybe in retrospect, some of those things were negatively impacting on me and my ideas of masculinity. But understanding that anyone has the freedom and the right to make any kind of art that they make. But as black creators, I think there is a heightened expectation or heightened responsibility somewhat that I think we need to be very aware of in terms of when we create, and how the visibility element, even though that might feed into a lot of tokenism from these institutions and these white imperialist structures that are there to capitalize on us and the black pound and the black dollar, understanding that visibility could be used in a very negative way, because if young people point to that and saying, well, that's the person that comes from similar environments like you, they're saying this, they're making stuff like this, they're saying it's okay to do this, they're doing things like this, the media forum of the world that we are privy to, so therefore that's what is expected of you, and you should also follow that same narrative, and that could really become very dangerous for young people to really have that as the only representations that they have. So the plea is to work towards getting a much more diverse representation of what black identities can be and should be in these spaces, and ultimately pointing out to people in their very, very close proximity, in their vicinity, in their environments, as people that model behaviors and characteristics that should be aspired for. So teachers, incredible black teachers should be heralded as people that young people should model in behavior and characteristics if they are, but these are far and few between. And ultimately, in some cases, again, when I speak about the idea of representation, there are these black teachers in these institutions that model and project the same ideologies as the other white leaders who have conscious, unconscious bias and racism and these structures. So understanding that it's not just representation we're talking about representation that is steeped in integrity and steeped in the desire to purport ideas that are counter stereotypical in the ways that allow young people to see versions of themselves that they perhaps not imagined before. And this is the role that we have in trying to counter this idea from a societal, institutional, structural perspective, being able to take on the responsibility as creators to be able to imagine a world presents ideas of these counter stereotypical visions to young black kids and young black children in the world growing up. And that's something that I think for me is such a powerful realization as I got older, how the lack of some of these in other industries really kind of challenged the ways in which, especially, the ways in which my parents or my mother in particular, because my father didn't have any say in that, how their visions of the world that I should grow up into should be. How my mother really struggled to allow me to express myself in the ways that inevitably led me to my life's purpose and goal, because there was no vision of her seeing somebody that was in a positive light, following a creative pathway, because her ideas, I was going to be a gangster, I was going to be out here shooting and holding various illegal weaponry and all these other things, based on the ideas that she's also being fed and based on the ideas of what's been readily purported to us on these other platforms. So understanding that for me, there was a somewhat radical attempt to follow, even against the will of my mother and the environment that I grew up in, a pathway that allowed me to model versions of myself based on people that I held a lot of integrity, and therefore inevitably leading me to what I do now, which then for me, being able to model that to young black boys, like was evidenced in the clips that I showed, how those things that they spoke about was based upon the idea that they were able to see characteristics in me that perhaps they had not been readily exposed to, and seeing a black man come into the environment on a regular basis with consistency and modeling these versions to them that showed all these things that were different to what they perceived. There's a power and value in that. And that's what I would hope that, moving forward, we stress things like that. We stress the context, we stress the characteristics and the qualities of the individuals, as opposed to the successes of those individuals as a sole kind of aspirational tool. Being able to create more structures of mentorship in different industries, being able to have that interpersonal time with young people to be able to model personal and really interesting nuances of the journeys to young people, to paint a much more holistic, much more representative picture of the journey, as opposed to just the outcome as something to aspire for. So that's one of the things that I think is important to really just kind of explore for us when we think about ourselves and our roles as educators, as parents, as community leaders, activists, to be able to find ways to present mentors as opposed to just ideas of role models to young people with context, to allow them to be able to start to shape and imagine a version of themselves in a world that is set up for them to not achieve those things and set up for them not to thrive, but against those odds, providing opportunities for them to develop characteristics that are worth modeling, as opposed to just the outcomes of particular role models or caricatures of models for young people to aspire to. Because as human beings, no individual is perfect. So modeling somebody's life as something to aspire for a young person, could also be dangerous based on the decisions that person can choose to make in their lives. I mean, just like I'm sure you can attest to, I've seen a lot of people that I, heralded as incredible, models at certain points in my life make particular actions in their lives which were derided, rightfully so, but without actually understanding that they're human beings, and ultimately understanding that if we model characteristics as opposed to outcomes in individuals, then what we do see is the nuance of still being inspired by particular characteristics in an individual, even though that individual is flawed. And I think that's something that's important to explore when we think about, resurrecting some particular models and mentors to young people in the educational mentorship sort of relationship that we might be able to cultivate with these groups of young people moving forward. So hopefully that kind of sparks some thoughts in your mind in terms of how you present these ideas of modeling and mentorship and role modeling to young people. And I look forward to joining you guys in the next episode. Much peace and love.